for stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farrow.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, happy bank holiday morning on this August bank holiday, and welcome to the briefing with me, Tom Harwood. We've got a lot to get stuck into today. Not only the Tory leadership race, the housing crisis, but also the restoration and renewal of Parliament. Is our mother of parliaments crumbling down? That, and maybe even a little bit of space after the headlines.
A very good morning, it's 9:33. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. NASA is making its final preparations ahead of a planned launch of its new moon rocket later today. The unmanned rocket is called Space Launch System, and it's going to propel a test capsule called Orion far from Earth into the moon's orbit. The latest mission's aiming to prove that people can go to the moon for longer and more sustainably than ever before. The rocket's scheduled to take off from the Kennedy Space Centre just after 1:30 this afternoon, and we'll bring it to you here. Liz Truss's campaign says she favours targeted support to ease the cost of living crisis rather than help for all. However, the Tory leadership candidate says she's not ruling anything out as the contest enters its final week. Well, Environment Minister and Team Rishi supporter Victoria Prentice told us the former Chancellor believes help should go to those who need it the most.
Rishi's plan is very much to target that help at the most vulnerable households. So, for example, pensioner households or people with disabilities or households on the lowest incomes. And I think that's the right way to go. I know this is hard for everybody, but for some people it's really hard, and we need to help them get through it.
The International Atomic Energy Agency says the safety and security of Europe's biggest nuclear facility must be protected. An inspection team from the UN's nuclear watchdog is on its way to Ukraine to investigate the now Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Ukraine's President Zelensky called for an assessment over fears of a nuclear accident amid intense fighting. The Royal Navy's largest warship has broken down overnight off the south coast of the UK, shortly after embarking for exercises in the US. It's HMS Prince of Wales that left from Portsmouth Naval Base on Saturday before an emerging technical issue occurred. The 65,000-ton vessel's departure had already been delayed on Friday because of a different technical issue. You're up to date on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now let's go back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing. It's 9:35 and my name's Tom Harwood. Now, before we dive into the politics today, I want to acknowledge something fairly exciting happening on the other side of the Atlantic. The final preparations are, of course, underway for the launch of Artemis 1, the most powerful rocket NASA has ever built. This will be a full-on test run for the next human mission to the moon. If all goes well today, with today's unmanned test flight around the moon, the next time this rocket flies, Artemis 2, will be carrying humans around the moon. And then Artemis 3 will make those first human moon landings for over half a century. It's extraordinary to me that the last time man landed on the moon was December 1972. For context, that's before the United Kingdom joined the EEC. A new lunar world of exploration opened up in 1969 with Neil Armstrong's famous, if somewhat disputed, first ever words on a celestial body other than Earth. But 3 years later, the world seemed to have lost interest. The Vietnam War, the oil crisis, and the first Earth Day, coupled with the fact that most considered the space race well and truly won, meant that NASA pared back its budgets and reduced its ambition. Now it's only with the entrance of the private sector to space that it's all become possible again. Private partners will be taking a greater role in low Earth orbit, allowing NASA to go further. And the landing of Artemis 3, this mission itself, will be done in none other than a SpaceX human landing system. Today marks the start of a more sustainable public-private partnership return to the moon. If all goes well, the launch window opens at just after 1:30 this afternoon, UK time, and we'll be sure to bring it to you live on GB News. Well, getting on with today's show, it's just about a week to go until our next Prime Minister takes on not only the keys to number 10, but the reins of the country too. The Tory leadership candidates continue to clash on their respective approaches to tackle the cost of living crisis after Friday's sobering Ofgem price cap announcement. Truss is understood to now be considering a 5 percentage point reduction in VAT, an expensive move that Camp Sunak call regressive and flawed. Elsewhere, more than 25,000 migrants and refugees have now crossed the Channel to the UK so far this year. These new government figures have revealed a total of 915 people were detected on Saturday alone, just one day. And Labour has unveiled their plan to tackle the courts backlog. They say the promotion of junior prosecutors will get the wheels of justice turning. That's according to Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry, speaking as almost 350,000 cases, 350,000 cases await trial. Members of the Criminal Bar Association last week voted in favour of an indefinite and uninterrupted strike. Well, it can seem all a little bit chaotic in British politics. Well, let's make sense of some of those key stories now with Benedict Spence, a political commentator and journalist who joins me now. And Benedict, I suppose the first thing to say is thank goodness it's only a week left in this Tory leadership contest.
Oh, yes.
Almost this time next week, we'll know who's won.
It's a good thing we don't have a month left, say, to try to find out who we already know is going to be Prime Minister. I mean, that would have been a real disaster, a real poor set of planning. No, we're only a few days left, relatively, but I think still some concern around the fact that actually we've not got much of a clear plan, I don't think, from either candidate, but especially actually from Liz Truss, because she is going to be the Prime Minister unless something unforeseen happens. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in, and it does seem to still be Liz Truss offering tax cuts, which are obviously very popular with her voters in the Conservative Party, but not actually necessarily popular amongst all Tory voters at large, not necessarily that popular amongst MPs, not necessarily that popular amongst the rest of the country. And it does then boil down to that old adage, which is that, you know, it's all very well being ideologically very pure, as Jeremy Corbyn was for the Labour Party, one wing of the Labour Party. If you're not actually going to be in government to sort of force those issues through, to be ideologically pure, that's not very helpful. Now, Liz Truss is not going to have a lot of wiggle room. She doesn't have that much time after she becomes Prime Minister until we get into the next general election cycle. And as I've just pointed out, she doesn't actually have relatively that much support from within the party in the House of Commons. And she is dealing with something pretty catastrophic, actually, in scale. So even if she does bring in a raft of tax cuts, we probably aren't actually going to see the net benefits of those, if there are any, for some time down the line, possibly not in time, in fact,
terms of
to save her.
Stimulating the economy and the wider effect of that. I suppose people will see it in their pay packets, but...
They will, but
I wonder, though, the constructive ambiguity of Liz Truss's policy position right now, in your view, Benedict Spence, does she actually have a plan? And she just doesn't want to say it before this vote until after she's in, and then she can reveal something that maybe the Tory members might not like so much, maybe a lot of spending, or does she not have a plan at all and she's trying to wing it, floating ideas, seeing what lands and what doesn't? Where are we in
I think it's the former. I would be horrified if it were the latter, actually, and I would be saying that that's a dereliction of duty and she shouldn't be standing to be leader of the Conservative Party or Prime Minister, if that were the case. So I have to actually hope that it is the former, because I don't really see that there are any alternatives. Matthew Parris is not a columnist I tend to agree with, but he did make a very good point in his Sunday Times column last week, which is that, by and large, although many sort of small state Conservatives would acknowledge that they want states to be smaller, right now the state is not the thing that's holding back places in the Red Wall. He used Mansfield as the example. It's the only thing that's propping these places up. And actually, it'll take time to get the investment, to get rid of the regulation, to get the circumstances, the environment, to actually turbocharge these parts of the country. Because honestly, this is the result of... This is not, I'm afraid, just the result of Russia invading Ukraine or even just the pandemic. This is institutional decay, and it's private and public sector. You know, both sides have been asleep at the wheel, and it does go back over decades. That is not something that can be undone overnight with a series of, even if they are quite aggressive tax cuts, it can't be undone in a small space of time. This is something that will require, on the one hand, short-term alleviation of pressure, but it will also require Liz Truss, I'm afraid, to come out with a plan and say, this is how we are going to solve energy issues long-term. This is how we're going to solve water shortage issues long-term. And that might involve a lot more spending. That might involve not being able to make the kind of tax cuts that she's initially pledging to her supporters. As you say, that might not go down very well with them. They might sit there and go, well, if we're getting this sort of big state, we might as well go for Rishi Sunak, who does have experience of this. So you can understand, I think, why she is being a little stum at this stage. But she's not going to be able to keep that way for very long, actually. It's going to have to be right out of the traps the second she's in number 10. The country needs this. The markets need this. There needs to be support for ordinary people. And, you know, that old cliche, winter is coming, haha. It is actually going to hit people very hard. People are already feeling it now when the weather is, in the mid-20s, early 30s. So, you know, not a lot of wiggle room, I'm afraid.
It's going to be really, really fascinating. Potentially next week, some big announcements at the start of a Liz Truss premiership. If, of course, those polls are right and Liz Truss actually will become Prime Minister. Well, Benedict Spence, thank you for joining us this morning. Moving on now from the content of our political landscape to the landscape of our politics. Those of you who have visited or passed by the Palace of Westminster will have noticed the swathes of the building sheathed in mesh and scaffolding. But what's the story behind these extensive works, and what really needs to be done? Well, I caught up with the expert Lord Norton, who is widely regarded to be one of the country's greatest living experts on Parliament. Welcome to the Palace of Westminster, or at least seen from one of the few angles where you can't see that much scaffolding. I'm here today to talk about exactly what's going on with all of the scaffolding we see covering the sides of the Palace of Westminster, blighting, some would say, Parliament. What's going on with all of that construction, maintenance and restoration work? I caught up with the constitutional expert and member of the House of Lords, Lord Norton, to tell us exactly what the restoration and renewal project is all about. Lord Norton, it seems like we've been talking about the grand restoration and renewal project of the British Parliament for years now. And it seems like there have been so many discussions, debates and votes, and yet nothing has really been agreed. It seemed at one stage people wanted to leave Parliament to repair it. Now it looks like an iterative process. The whole place is constantly clad in scaffolding. What on earth is going on? Why haven't any decisions been made?
Well, you're quite right, and it's not that it's not progressed. In fact, it's regressed in terms of the decisions that have been taken. If anything, we're going backwards on earlier decisions. We did pass an Act of Parliament to try and address it. Now the intention is to move away from that. And I think it's a clash between recognising the need to do something to deal with the palace. It is in a state of decay, against members who are reluctant to move out? Does that tend, oh, well, yes, something must be done, but not now, because it's extraordinarily expensive to keep the palace as it is maintained, never mind the cost of having to restore and renew the place.
So this is the interesting distinction. I know that maintenance as it stands sometimes runs over £100 million a year just to keep things standing still, or according to one recent report, actually to keep things sliding backwards but at a slower pace than they might otherwise be. Why on earth have we got this gridlock over making a decision?
Money, it's thought, well, it'd be politically unacceptable to spend 17-20 billion pound on renewing it, although if they try and stay in, the cost becomes even more exorbitant.
Let's take a step back and just, I think there's a wide understanding that the Palace of Westminster is quite old, is failing in places, not just in those who we elect, but also in the structure of it itself. It's crumbling to bits. Just how bad has it got?
It's got very bad because it was built in the mid-19th century and nothing really substantial done since the Second World War. It's been patching things up as we've gone along, which is now just the problem because so much has been done on an incremental basis. There are wires all over the place. There are actually flues which are so concentrated with wires in them that you can't get into them because they're just chock-a-block and nobody's sure where all the wires go. The challenge is enormous, and it is in a state of complete disrepair, and there is the prospect of catastrophic failure. The water system might give up or some other infrastructure, making the place uninhabitable anyway, and we're just having to try and tread water to keep the place going, but in a way that it's actually difficult to keep on top of.
Currently, as I understand it, there are individuals who are hired to walk around the building 24/7, just looking out for fire. Yes. How have we got to that stage?
The estate is a great fire. It's the palace. As you say, we've got fire watchers. They're there 24 hours a day going round, making sure that the places that there isn't a fire, which are absolutely catastrophic. So the sort of maintenance minor costs each year, it's about £15 million cost the public purse. But then there are other major projects as well, which this year, next year, the year after, run at roughly about 100 million. So over the next 4 or 5 years, the cost of the public purse of just keeping it going is going to be about £400 or £500 million.
There are a number of parliaments around the world that have suffered this same dilemma, most notably and probably most comparably Canada, where they have decided to decant. For 10 years, multiple parliamentary terms, they are sitting in a pretend House of Commons, one that's built in a separate building temporarily, and they conduct their business in that. Is that what we're facing? Potentially over a decade of MPs not being in the same chamber that Winston Churchill stood in, that Clement Attlee stood in, that Margaret Thatcher stood in, potentially losing that sense of history for over a decade?
Well, that would be the best case scenario, just 10 years or more moving out, because if we try and stay in and work round it, it wouldn't have the same characteristics, the same features we associate with Parliament. I say that could take up to 70 years or more.
70 years?
Well, 76, I think, was the latest estimate, at enormous public expense. So the least costly option, and the one that would take least time, is that of both houses decanting for 10, 15 years, possibly a bit longer, so that it can be undertaken.
And I suppose the terrible irony here is that this is a palace that was constructed in response to a big catastrophic event. The old Palace of Westminster, the Church of St Stephen's and the rest of it burning down in 1834 as a response to a tally stick fire beneath the House of Lords.
That's the real danger, that there's a repeat, because there's a major fire risk, it could burn down. And the difference is that this time we're dealing with a site that's a World Heritage Site, Grade 1 listed. It's so iconic that we want to preserve it. So to lose it would be a complete, not just national disaster, but obviously international, global, in terms of its impact. So we need to preserve it. But the longer we prevaricate and can't make up our mind as to what to do about it, of course, the greater the danger of that happening. So the danger is the decision will be taken out of our hands because there will be some catastrophic failure.
So why is there all this netting around Victoria Tower?
That one is simply to catch any masonry that may fall. So it's actually a protective device, nothing to do with actually making any significant changes. It's purely because there have been problems with falling masonry throughout the palace. And I gather the Victoria Tower is a problem, and there is the prospect of some parts of it falling.
Until there is an enormous restoration project on the tower itself, a sort of cocoon perhaps, like there was with Elizabeth Tower at the other end, this will just stay there in perpetuity until something gets done.
Well, unless they're practicing to do anything else with it, but again, it would be temporary rather than part of the R&R programme. So there's lots of temporary measures just to protect places. Others, there will be some work done to patch it up. But I said that's what it is around the palace. It's just patching up until such time as we actually get round to undertaking R&R.
So I suppose until restoration and renewal starts properly, Parliament will continue to have big, ugly sheets of scaffolding engulfing it, waxing and waning at points, but sort of always there.
Absolutely. It will be a continuous process. Some part of the palace will just be engulfed in scaffolding of this sort, which is both extensive, aesthetically unappealing, and sends out a rather bad signal about Parliament, how people view the actual institution of Parliament. It's not drawing them in of wanting to come and see how Parliament operates.
Now, I suppose some people would say that the restoration and renewal project in and of itself will make Parliament look ugly for an expansive time.
There will be that, and the appeal will simply have to come and look at the two chambers operating separately from the palace, but it's the price one has to pay because one has to tackle the problem, and the problem is an unwillingness to bite the bullet.
Elizabeth Tower, as it was renamed in 2012, has recently become uncocooned. It was stuck in scaffolding for the best part of half a decade, and it looks magnificent now. It has been restored, but this is separate from restoration and renewal.
I mean, they've done a grand job, and this now looks as people expect it to look, so it's a great draw. But actually within the palace, you've still got all the problems, which is why we need restoration and renewal. So internally, it's in a state of great decay and potential problems which could be absolutely horrendous unless they're addressed fairly quickly. So this facade is completely misleading in terms of the challenge faced by the building as a working environment and one that's actually safe. In the early 70s, if you looked at the palace, it's in a dreadful state because of the effect of all the pollution. The exterior looked basically black, so they had to sandblast it.
This can be very misleading because the way that this has been done, the restoration of Elizabeth Tower, it now looks absolutely magnificent, but this is distinct, this is separate from restoration and renewal.
Yes, I mean, this is just part of maintaining it. What had to be done in any event internal to the palace is the fact that the infrastructure is in danger of collapsing, basically.
Well, Lord Norton there on the real scandal that is the ongoing attempts to restore Parliament and the political gridlock that has faced. Well, finally today, there's a particular bugbear of mine about how this country is run, about the structures that actually prevent us building the structures that this country needs. I'm delighted to be joined now by Freddie Poser, who's the director of Priced Out, a campaign on making sure that we can get, frankly, more affordable housing. But it's not just housing that the planning system is gumming up here. We've been talking about various crises for the last few weeks, whether it's energy, whether it's water. It all seems to feed in to one thing, and that's it's almost impossible to build things in this country.
Absolutely. So Priced Out, we focus on the housing crisis, which is fundamentally a supply crisis. We haven't built enough homes. But if you look at these other crises, we see things like water infrastructure, energy infrastructure and transport infrastructure is often blocked by the same processes, the same systems that block new housing. And that's the planning system and, to put a name on it, NIMBYs.
Well, let's have a look at some of these examples of NIMBYism. Over the weekend, I noticed that the Conservative MP Maria Caulfield had been delighted in campaigning against a solar farm in her constituency. Here's the tweet, boasting of blocking investment in new energy. Similarly, we're not just party-specific here. The Liberal Democrats' Layla Moran has been boasting of campaigning against a new mega reservoir, as she describes it. This, of course, just a few months before the water crises and hosepipe bans. We haven't built a new reservoir in the southeast of England since the 1970s. How have we got to this point?
Absolutely, and the Abingdon Reservoir has been proposed for decades, and it keeps getting blocked by NIMBYism. And the reason is that people never think about the bigger picture. They only think about their local area, and frankly, it's selfish, be it housing, solar farm, water infrastructure, exactly. They think about, well, what's the impact going to be on me, on my view, on my traffic? They don't think, well, what's the impact going to be on my children's generation or on the country as a whole? We desperately need this infrastructure and we need more housing to solve numerous crises, and we're just not doing it.
And very often when it comes to housing, people say that, well, the housing might come, but then we'd need more infrastructure. But it's the same systems and, frankly, local politics that is preventing that accompanying infrastructure going alongside the housing. Is there any sort of solution?
I mean, there are solutions. Whether they're politically feasible is a big question. I think that people in this country need to wake up and look at where we're going, this poly crisis that we're in. Part of it is external, of course, the Russia crisis, but part of it is that we haven't built this infrastructure. We're still using Victorian-era infrastructure when they actually built things. So we've got the oldest housing stock in Europe. We've got tiny houses. We need to build things. And I think the people who might object to this stuff, the people who gum up the planning system, they need to think about the impact of their own actions and what is the world they're leaving for the next generation.
Really, really interesting stuff there. Freddie Poser from Priced Out UK. Well, that's it for the show today. Coming up, it's To The Point with Mercy and Anaya. But first, here's the weather.
The UK is looking mostly dry and sunny, although a few showers will develop, mainly in the north. Let's take a look at the details. Well, it will be a largely sunny afternoon across the southwest, although a brisk easterly breeze will develop, especially over the moors and along the coast. Temperatures will be around the low 20s. Southeastern England and East Anglia will also see a keen breeze, which will bring in a fair bit of cloud off the North Sea. The north of Wales may see the odd shower this afternoon, but much of the country will be dry with the best of the sun in the west. The Midlands then will see a dry bank holiday afternoon, but there will be a fair bit of cloud around, especially in the east. Despite this, temperatures will remain in the low 20s. North East England is to have a rather cloudy afternoon with perhaps the odd spot of rain around. Pop over the Pennines though, as North West England will be dry with some sunshine. Western Scotland will also see some spells of sunshine this afternoon, but further east it will be cloudier. A few showers may also develop, especially over the higher ground. Northern Ireland then may also see the odd shower develop, but most will miss them and have a dry afternoon with some spells of sunshine. Temperatures here reaching 18 to 20 Celsius. Cloud will then melt away as we move towards the evening, but some showers will continue in the north, and that is how your weather is shaping up for this Bank Holiday Monday.